Okay. Hello again. It's been a few weeks since we talked about English. Today, so I did some thinking after last time we met and we talked about mostly punctuation, right? We got through commas and apostrophes. Or not apostrophes, excuse me. Commas and colons is what we talked about. My plan for today, so what I want to do is I have, based on where we're at as a class, I've kind of set up like 3 different lectures I want to talk about. The first one is punctuation, which we started last time and we're going to finish today. So we're going to group that into one lecture. I think those are really important because, in my opinion, those are the easiest questions, just because easiest, I mean, that doesn't mean they're easy, but the quickest they should be, because it's as simple as knowing a rule. So if you guys just know the rules, then you'll know the answer right away for a lot of those questions. And then the second one I want to do, hold on one second, sorry. The second one I want to cover is going to group these two together, grammar and usage and sentence structure. This is a pretty sizable portion of the test because it is like 40% of the test, so quite a bit of them. But I think there's about 6 rules that I call them the golden grammar rules. And I think if you know those 6 rules well, pretty much the rest of it will all fall into line. So I really want to spend some time talking about those rules eventually as just a lecture by itself. And then I have a third one planned that covers these 3 sections, just because each of them are very different questions. Organization, strategy, and author style are different types of questions. They follow a very similar pattern in how to attack them and how to get them right. So I've grouped them together in one lecture as well. So we'll do all 3 of these topics and then focus on practicing after that, just so we can apply what we've learned throughout my time with you guys. So yeah, I just wanted to put this out there so everyone knows the plan where we're going, at least with the English parts. So today we're going to continue on with punctuation. We've done commas and colons. We'll go through semicolons today. Apostrophes, dashes, and hyphens are the 4 we're going to cover. And then if we have leftover time, I might introduce the Golden Grammar lecture. We probably won't get into it too much just because I would like to do all 6 of those rules in one day because they relate to each other quite heavily. So I'd like to do those next time I'm with you guys. But today let's plan on, we're going to finish the punctuation lecture and then maybe introduce, or we can just have like an open time for questions if we get done early. Yeah, so that's the plan. I just wanted to tell you guys that just so everyone's like clear and understanding where we're going here. I think this is a really good breakdown of like the types of questions you'll see, so that's why I keep writing it up here. I had this up here last class too, and I think it's pretty helpful just to visualize like what you need to study and what you need to get ready for this specific part of the test. But so yeah, I just wanted to put that out. Oh Lord, I wanted to put that up there so we can all be on the same page. But okay, so today we're gonna go back to punctuation, and so wherever you took those notes last time, let's just continue on from there. So we ended with colons. So today we're gonna jump into semicolons. Is our first one. Oh, this marker's terrible. Whoops. Semicolons. And if anybody doesn't know, this is the one you normally make a winky face with on your phone. It's kind of like it's like a dot and a comma almost, like that. Similar. It looks similar to a colon, so that's the important thing. Where it's half of a colon, kind of. That's why it's called semicolon, but not super important there. There's only really 2 rules you'll have to know on the ACT for semicolons. One of them is significantly more important than the other one. So we're going to start with the more important one. The second one's kind of fun, and you'll see it once in a while, so I'm still going to mention it, but we won't spend as much time. But the first one, super important, and it's not super difficult either, I don't think. The first rule is simply that a semicolon will connect 2 independent clauses. So if you've heard connect 2 independent clauses, I'm sure your mind is thinking, oh, that's like really similar to a period or really similar to one of the colon rules we talked about. which was that you can separate two independent clauses, right, to provide emphasis. That was when we talked about last week. So this rule, it's very simple, and a lot of the times when I take this note, I sometimes just like to write like a period almost, use it like a period. Just because any use you can think of where you could use a period, you can use a semicolon as well. So the main time you're going to see a semicolon come up on the ACT is going to be in this regard. So for example, if I say, okay, can someone tell me, the sentence up here says, I like dark chocolate, chocolate, she likes milk chocolate. Someone tell me where the semicolon goes.
Chocolate.
Yeah, exactly right. So we have two different independent clauses here, right? I like dark chocolate, that's an independent clause, and then she likes milk chocolate, independent clause. Put a period here if you want. It works fine to have a period here too, right? I mean, we could do the same thing. Just as a small refresher from last time, what happens if I put the word and in there? Can I use a semicolon now?
Yeah, you just use a comma.
You could use a comma, exactly. So if you put the word and here, that was just really poorly written, sorry guys. Now you have I like dark chocolate and she likes milk chocolate. So what type of word is and? What class of words? Remember we said a little acronym for this last time? Fanboys, yeah. So that's a fanboy word. So when you have an independent, fanboys, independent, you use a comma in between, right? So that's just a small check from last time, right? We do need to continue to remember those things. Those will come up. But yeah, in this scenario, we're going to use a semicolon. And this is a small side test-taking strategy thing. So the way the test looks is they're going to underline a portion like this. And they're going to give you options, basically. So it'll be A, B, C, D, which one's correct. Now let's say, if they gave you an answer choice, like answer choice A was like, okay, you should use a semicolon. Answer choice B was, hey, you should use a period. And answer choice C is, use a comma, D is no punctuation or something. Anytime you have two answer choices where there's a period and a semicolon, how do you differentiate, and anyone can answer this, how do you differentiate between a period and a semicolon? How do you do that? It's a trick question. Anyone know? No, the trick question is, do you remember the first thing I told you last lecture when we talked about, what are you on the ACT English test? You're not a writer, but you're an editor, right? So as an editor, how do you pick between a period and a semicolon? Well, you can't, because it's a stylistic choice. And you as an editor don't have stylistic freedom to do what you want. So if you have two answer choices that have a semicolon and a period, you can right away eliminate them both. The reason is, the ACT is never going to ask you to pick between two answers that are stylistically different, not grammatically different. So the rule here is that periods and semicolons are grammatically the same thing. Now, there's stylistic differences between them. Why would you use one over the other? Well, maybe you feel like the sentences are more connected, or you don't want to have as much pause. You want to make sure that these two sit together that way when you're speaking or delivering. But stylistically, they're different, not grammatically. So if you have two answer choices where everything else in the answer choice is the same, but one of them has a period and one of them has a semicolon, then you can eliminate them both because they're not right. The ACT is never going to make you pick between them. In fact, if you have a colon in there as well, actually the ACT isn't going to make you do that either, because a colon can also separate independent clauses, and that's again for emphasis, which is a stylistic choice, not a grammatical one. So you could eliminate that too, and really there you go, you just got a free point because you didn't do anything, but you knew that those things were the same. So that's just a side note. This will come up a lot, where if you have two answers that are basically the same thing, you can eliminate them because they're not going to make you pick one over the other, right? So that's just an important test-taking tip, is look for things that are super duper similar, and if they are, then you can't pick between them as an editor, right? So use that rule of caution, obviously, but if the choice is the same everywhere else but that point, it's useful to be able to eliminate them both. Does this rule make sense to everybody? Online people, do we get that? Okay, awesome. Great. Let's go on to the second rule, and I find this one quite a bit more fun, to be honest. It's not used as much, but I recently used it in an essay, and I thought it was pretty cool. It was pretty fun. Fun rule, but the way they describe it in textbooks is kind of confusing and hard to take in. So I like to call it, I gave it a little bit of more of a fun name, call it the super comma. Now, what does it mean to be a super comma? Well, let's say, I'm going to give you an example before I give you the rule. Let's say I'm talking about a few different cities that I've been to. Or let's say I've been to a city, a few of them, let's say. Okay, so I have been to, where have I been? Let's just start with some simple. I've been to Sioux City, Iowa. Oops, sorry, I was cheating. Sioux City, Iowa. I've been to New York. Let's do that one. And I've also been to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's where I'm from. So let's do that one. Oops, forgot and. Now, again, we're going to point to a rule that we talked about last time. A few different rules, actually. There's two different rules here. So if we were to just follow the comma rules from last time, remember we talked about separating cities from states with commas, right? So if we have Sioux City, Iowa, we're going to put a comma in between Sioux City and Iowa. Here, New York, we're going to put a comma in between there. And Sioux Falls, South Dakota, we're going to put a comma in between there. Does that make sense? Good? Following? Okay. Now, we also have a list, right? And when we're listing things, we know that we separate items in a list with commas, right? So if we were to do that, we would have Sioux City, comma, Iowa, comma, New York, comma, and Sioux Falls, comma, South Dakota. Do you see how overwhelming that is of how many commas there are? If I didn't know what cities you were talking about and what states you were talking about, how do I know it's not just Sioux City, Iowa, New York, Sioux Falls, South Dakota? That's kind of confusing. Now, we know that's not what this means, right, because we know cities and states. But if we didn't, that could be extremely confusing. So when you're listing something that already has commas in it, then instead of using commas to differentiate and list them, you're going to use semicolons. Does that make sense, kind of? So the rule is that, let's put it down here. When listing I'm going to say items that already have commas, separate with semicolons. Does that kind of make sense? How that works, right? When you're listing things like this. Another example would be if you're listing like dates. Do you remember we talked about when you separate the date from the year, right? It's important to do something like this too when you're listing a bunch of dates. It's really confusing when you have numbers just like flying around and there's commas all over the place. It's just very hard for the reader to understand what you're trying to say. So another good grammatical rule here is to use. This doesn't come up a ton, but it's not often that you're listing things with commas already in them, but it does happen. So, yeah, super comma rule. Does that make sense where I got the name? It's pretty cool. It's a good name. Does the rule make sense to everybody? Awesome. Online, you guys getting this? Cool. Awesome. All right. Always feel free to shout out questions if you don't know or if you're unsure. There's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so those are the only two semicolon rules we have here. So more often than not, when you see a semicolon, it's probably going to be the first rule, right? But just keep in mind that second one. Okay, let's talk about apostrophes. This is a hard word to spell. I'm going to need some support. Apostrophes, like that, I think. And it looks like if you were to take a comma and just flip it upside down, it's coming from the top instead of the bottom. So this one is, I have four rules kind of, but it's really one rule and like 3 exceptions kind of, or like 3 different ways to apply that one rule. So let's start with this. What do you guys think of when you see an apostrophe? What do you think of? Well, go ahead.
Ownership.
Ownership is exactly right. That's basically what we're going to be covering here. So the first and most important rule is that an apostrophe shows possession or ownership. Right? So that's the most, I definitely spelled possession wrong. Is it like that? Whatever, who cares? Spelling's not on the ACT, so don't worry about it. But, yeah. Now, let's, hold on, how do I want to, okay, yeah, let's jump into a simple example, right? So, like, if I went over and what's your name?
Addie.
Addie, and it's spelled?
A-D-D-Y.
A-D-D-Y, perfect. Okay, so let's say I'm really mad at Addie, and I'm sick of the way she's taking notes. So I went over and I stole Addie's pencil. Can someone tell me where I'm supposed to put an apostrophe here? Go ahead, yeah.
Between the Y and the S.
Right, Addie's pencil, right? And that shows what?
Ownership.
Yeah, it shows that the pencil belongs to Addie, right? So this rule, this much is quite simple, right? We have all seen this before, right? Online, you guys have seen this rule before? In school or something? Yeah, great. Now what happens if, this is going to get a little tricky now. Is anyone named Chris in here? Is there a Chris? No Chris's. Okay, well pretend there's a Chris. Chris is sitting right here. And Addie's mad at me, but I'm best friends with Chris. So she's going to steal Chris's pencil to get back. So to get back at me, Addie stole, how do we want to spell Chris? Let's say Chris is spelled like that in this scenario. There's a lot of ways, but Chris's pencil. Let's just leave it like this for now, actually. So how do you put an apostrophe on this word? Can someone raise their hand and tell me that? Online, does anyone have a guess? How do you put an apostrophe on the word Chris?
Is it at the end?
At the end, so just like this? No, it's okay. I would rather you guys just guess. It's the best way to learn is to not know.
Wouldn't you just still put an S on it?
Still put an S on it? Why would you put an S on it instead of just having the apostrophe on the end? Because the word ends in an S.
Because doesn't like an apostrophe on the end mean something else?
An apostrophe on the end does signal possession. It doesn't mean anything else, but this is a very tricky circumstance where you have a word like Chris. The rule we learn in school more often than not is when you have a word that ends in S, you just put an apostrophe on the end of it and don't add anything else, right? But let's think about, this is under a lot of debate amongst the people who make these rules, but I'm going to give you my opinion and what the ACT's rule is. So let's say we're talking about Chris. How do you say this? Can someone raise their hand and just read it out loud for me? Go ahead, what is it?
Addie stole Chris's pencil.
Chris's pencil, right? Did you read Chris' pencil? You read Chris's pencil, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me it makes a lot of sense to put this S here, right? You did it phonetically. You said Chris's pencil. But technically the rule is that the reason this S does go there is because the word Chris is singular. That's one person.
Mm-hmm.
So if at any time it's singular, you're going to put apostrophe S. It doesn't matter if the word ends in an S.
So if it's plural and has an S at the end,
Then
you would just put an
yes.
apostrophe.
We'll talk about that rule in a second here too. So like let's look at another example of this. That's technically my second rule here of this Chris scenario. The second rule technically is anytime it's singular, apostrophe S is what you're going to do. Now, and then related to that, if plural and it ends with S, then you're just going to put apostrophe. There's a ton of exceptions to this. This is one of the most confusing concepts in all of English. But the ACT, when they give you plurals like this, they're just going to follow these rules. Because, like for example, a very tricky one is fish. Fishes. Like, you know, which one's the correct plural? And technically they mean different things. So like a side note, if anyone cares, fish is like the same group. It's the same group, the same type of fish. A group of them is called fish. But let's say you have goldfish and clownfish and whatever else type of fish, then that is fishes because they're different types. So then this rule gets extremely confusing when you have different plurals like that. Don't worry about that. That's not going to come up for you guys on this test. But this is the rule in general that you're going to follow. And you can actually change the meaning of a sentence entirely depending on how you use this. So I'm going to give you an example of, let's make fun of Chris again. So Chris now, okay, so for anyone who can't read it, I know this marker's getting a little old, but the sentence says, Chris couldn't decide which of his girlfriend's dresses he liked best. Now let's talk about this example we've put up here. Let's assume Chris is a good man. He has one girlfriend. Well, if we're talking about a singular thing, right? A girlfriend, a singular girlfriend, then we're going to put the apostrophe here. Now what this sentence means is Chris couldn't decide, well, his girlfriend has a bunch of dresses, and he couldn't decide which dress he likes best, right? That makes sense? Let's say Chris is not such a good guy, and we put it over here. Now that means Chris can decide which one of his girlfriend's dresses he likes best. Now that means he has multiple girlfriends, and they're all wearing a dress, and he can't decide which one he likes. Does that make sense? So just by moving this apostrophe and doing nothing else, I changed the entire meaning of the sentence, right? So Chris could get in a lot of trouble, or could be completely fine, just by where you place that apostrophe. So does this rule kind of make sense now? I like to give this example just because it shows you, like, without changing anything else in the sentence, I entirely changed the meaning, right? So having an apostrophe in the right spot means a lot. Does that make sense, online people? Yeah? Good. Okay, yeah, this is one I definitely would keep an eye on. And if you guys ever do have questions on this, feel free to ask. This might come up later on too, and who knows, by the time you guys are my age, this rule might have changed, because people that make the rules of English, like, talk and argue about this all the time. But this is the way it is for now, so just look out there. Now, third rule. Let's jump to, I feel like this one should be quite obvious, but you'd be surprised how not obvious it is, because so many people struggle with this one. I'm going to grab a new marker so you guys can see better. 1 second. Okay. So the third rule here, I think we do this when we talk, and I feel like it should be pretty obvious, but you'd be surprised. But the rule technically is use apostrophe S only at the end of hyphenated words. It's a really hard word to spell. Hyphenated. Like that. You're only going to use apostrophe S at the end. Only at the end. Now, this may seem intuitive, this may seem like obvious, but we'll talk about hyphenated words in a minute here when we talk about hyphens, so don't worry if that doesn't make sense to you right now. But when you see a hyphenated word, and don't worry about why it's hyphenated right now, we'll get to that, but like, I'll tell you now, brother-in-law is a hyphenated word, but it has no hyphens in between. Now, let's say you're talking about your brother-in-law's ring, the ring that belongs to your brother-in-law. You would be shocked how many people like to say, brothers-in-law's ring. Does that sound right? No. So what you should say is brother-in-law's ring, right? So when you have a hyphenated word, you're only going to use apostrophe S at the end of the word. So right here. Not in brother, not in. Brother-in-law's ring. Does that make sense? Okay. Another example would be like a diamond in the rough is another example of a hyphenated word. You wouldn't say the diamonds, ins, thes, roughs, whatever. You're gonna say diamond in the roughs. Whatever they're possessing. Does that make sense? Online, does that make sense? Okay. I feel like this one is pretty straightforward, but it just gets like missed a lot because I don't know, maybe people just haven't seen it before. It's different when it's written versus when you're speaking, obviously, right? But yeah, so good. Okay, last rule here. Can I have? Oh, this is a good rule. Okay, what are your guys' names? Kira and
Sia.
okay, Kira and Sia. So let's say we're talking about. I'm gonna give you the example first. Is Kira Kyra?
Kiera.
It's like a 50-50 on that. Okay. Sia is SIA.
SEEY.
SEEY? What? There's A at the end?
Yeah.
Okay. Never seen it spelled like that before. Okay. So we're talking about Kira and Sia, and let's say we're talking about okay. Let's say this is the sentence that we're going for. We're going to talk about a house that is owned in some way. So I'm going to give you two different examples here. Let's start by saying, let's imagine that they're twins for now. They're twins, and they own this one house together that lives on the coast, and it's so beautiful. Then, can you guys tell me, is it better to do this, Kira's and Sia's house, or is it better to do this, Kira and Sia's house? Which one would be right?
The second one.
Second one. Why is the second one?
Because
It sounds weird the other way. Yeah, that's fine. That's completely acceptable. So when you have two nouns, when you're talking about one thing, that's joint possession is what we call that, then you only put the apostrophe S on the final noun. Does that make sense, kind of, what I just said there? So we have two different nouns here, right? Two subjects, Kira and Sia. And if they own the house together, they both have possession of the house, then we're only going to put apostrophe S in the last noun. Now let's say they're not twins anymore, they're just acquaintances, and they have two houses on the beach that are both pretty, is what you're trying to say. Well, now you would say Kira's house and Sia's house individually. So Kira's and Sia's houses are pretty. Does that make sense? So now this is what you would call separated possession, where now we have each of them possessing their own house. Does that make sense? Where that's coming from? So the rule I would write as, if you do last noun, apostrophe S, that indicates joint possession. But if you do all nouns, that indicates separate possession. Does that make sense? Where I'm coming from there? Online people, does that kind of make sense? Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah, this one can be tricky. I mean, when I framed it to you like the way I did, everyone pretty much said the right answer there, but on the test, this can be a little bit nervy and like one of those that you're kind of unsure about, so that's why it's important to remember what each of those are. But it seems like you guys pretty much got it Are we good to? Did you guys have time to write this down? Sorry. Try not to rush too much. Do you need an extra second to write it down?
I'm good.
Good. Online, are you guys good? Can I erase? Okay. Awesome. Awesome. Okay. That's all I have for you on apostrophes. Now we're going to cover the two that people mix up the most. And those are dashes and hyphens. Does anyone know the difference, like right now, between dash and hyphen? Awesome. That's great. Online, does anyone know the difference between a dash and a hyphen? Someone does. Okay. Great. Okay, well, this will be a little bit of review for whoever that is. I can't tell the name, but anyway, this is the most confused one because people... It's just, why would you know the difference between this? It's not that important in the real world. But on the ACT English, it very much is. So let's start with dashes. Why do the markers keep... Sick of it. Come on. There we go. Dashes. Now, starting with the dash, it's the bigger of the two. That's what separates them. So a dash is going to look like that. It's pretty wide. And I have, let's see, 1, 2, that's it actually. 2 words. Or two rules for dashes. And once again, one is going to be way more common than the other. This one is also the second rule is extremely confusing. So I'm going to try to spend a little time explaining that. And then if you guys have more questions, we'll show it in context eventually on like an actual test. And then we'll cover it again when we're practicing there. But the first rule I think is, again, you're going to recognize it because it's based on a different rule. I call it just a dash hug. Now, does that sound familiar to some people? Dash hug? What other punctuation mark have we talked about that can give hugs?
Quotation.
Not quotations. It was the first thing we talked about. Commas.
Commas.
Yeah, commas. Commas can give hugs too, right? We talked about how if you have something non-essential or like interrupting in a sentence, you can use commas on both sides of it to just kind of set it off to be like, oh, this is something interrupting. And if there's 2 commas hugging something, if you remove that part from the sentence, the rest of it still should make sense, right? Do you guys remember? Does that ring a bell a little bit? Right? Talked about comma hugs last time. So a dash hug is pretty much the same thing. You can put a dash on one side and a dash on the other side of a non-essential or an interrupting phrase, and that's completely correctly punctuated. Now, a lot of people ask, what's the difference then between a comma hug and a dash hug? Well, there's not a lot of difference here, but there is 2 things that differentiate a dash hug from a comma hug. One of them is more emphasis. Putting a dash hug makes you do that when the information is more interrupting than previously. You know, like with a comma hug. It's a little bit stronger than a comma hug, you might say. So if this were the only thing, if you saw a comma hug and a dash hug as answer choice A and answer choice B, what can you do?
Eliminate.
You can eliminate them, exactly, because how are you as an editor going to pick between a dash and a comma? So, excuse me, a lot of the times they are interchangeable. Now the second rule I'm going to give you is the reason you can't do that, because this rule actually grammatically differentiates a comma hug between a dash hug. Now, with a dash hug, you can set off a whole sentence. So when you have a comma hug, you can set off a little, like a smaller phrase, basically. Like something interrupting that, non-essential that you could take out, it would still make sense, but it's not a whole independent. Let me just say that, actually. You can set off an independent clause. Whereas, you can't do that with a comma. You can set off a dependent clause as non-essential. You can't set off an independent clause. I'll throw an example up here of a little bit of both. So let's start with this. Oh, I'm sorry. Are you guys done writing this? Good? Everyone wrote that? Online? Good? Okay, I'm going to give it another minute because a few of them are thinking. But I'm going to give an example of one where you could use a comma hug or a dash hug, and then I'll give you an example of you have to use a dash hug and not a comma hug. So we'll talk about the two different options. Okay. Start with okay, let's say you're talking about your preparation for the ACT. My preparation for the ACT, doing the homework, I just wrote, okay, wow. Interesting. Sorry guys. Homework and studying ensured that I did well. Now, if you used a comma hug here, here, and here, my preparation for the ACT, doing the homework and studying, ensured that I did well. Or ensured I did well. Does that make sense as a sentence? Yeah. Now, the way you could check that with the comma hug like we talked about last time is just pretend this part is not here. Eliminate the thing inside of the commas. Because the sentence still makes sense. So then it would read, my preparation for the ACT ensured I did well. Does that make sense as a sentence? Yeah. So that means a comma hug is fine there. You can also use a dash hug in this scenario, where you just have a dash and a dash. My preparation for the ACT, doing the homework and studying, ensured that I did well. So this puts a little bit more emphasis on that part where it's a little more interrupting, but they're not going to make you pick that because it's a little unfair. Now let's say now the sentence reads, my preparation for the ACT, I did the homework and studied, ensured I did well. Is that okay as a sentence? Does that make sense? I think you're on the right track. What do you think? No? Why not?
I don't know.
Don't know? Why not? Why is that not?
There's no.
Online, does anyone know?
It doesn't like sound grammatically correct.
It doesn't sound right. You're right. It's not right. Online, does anyone know why that's incorrect?
Does it have anything to do with saying hi? To start with?
Kinda. Yeah, you could say that. Let me give you a hint. What is this right here? I did the homework and studied.
A sentence.
It's an independent clause, right? Can a comma hug set off an independent clause? No, it's not strong enough. That's the difference between a comma hug and a dash hug. So here you have to use a dash hug. Because you set off an entire independent clause in the middle. That's the difference between a comma hug and a dash hug. Yeah.
On the ACT, would like if you had a question like this, would it probably give you a comma as an option and a dash as an option?
It's possible, but probably not. That would be quite hard if they did. I do mention it in case they do, but I would be surprised. More often than not, it'll be clear to you. Most of the time what happens is they'll give you like this. This is the part that you have to fix. And it'll be like, oh, right here, what do you put? Do you put a comma? Do you put a dash? Do you put a period? What do you put there?
Will the other dash be there?
Yeah.
Oh.
So then a lot of the times, it's just like, oh, well, there's a dash there, so you don't want to put a comma here. You're going to put a dash, right? Does that make sense? So more often than not, it's going to look like that. The rule I first learned when I was in this class, the tutor told me, if you see one dash, it's very likely there's another one. That's a really good rule to look out for. Does that make sense? Does this dash hug thing kind of make sense? Online people, are you getting this? Yeah? Cool. This is a bit of a tricky one, but it's similar to that comma hug, so that's why. Now the second rule, a little bit harder to understand because grammatically, it's like, a lot of these, there's a rule, and you just follow that rule, and it's like, it applies or it doesn't. This one's a little bit more ambiguous as a rule in general, but it makes sense sometimes. I don't know. It's just it's a whole thing. So if you want to, a dash can help add words to the end of a sentence. Oh, whoa. Sentence. A clear break in flow. A clear break in flow. What does that mean? Honestly, very, 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 very hard to tell you exactly what a clear break in flow is. But basically, this rule, grammatically, it means that if you have a complete sentence and then you add something on to the end of it, then you use a dash. So, like, I'm talking about my basketball game today, and I was playing against Addie, and oh my gosh, Addie was so good, there was no way we were going to win. So let's say I have this example. We were never going to win that game. That's a complete sentence, right? We were never going to win that game. That's an independent clause. Now let's say I'm a devious little guy, and I had this thought that, like, well, what if I injure Addie? Well, then maybe we can win the game, right? So, like, that's something that I'm going to add on to the end. So if I want to add unless does that make sense here, where I put the dash? So there's a complete sentence, we were never going to win that game. And then I had a break in flow, and I wanted to add something else. So I said, unless Addie got hurt. Does that kind of make sense? Now, a lot of the times, when they use the word unless, you'll see this too. We talk like this a lot, where we're saying, like, well, unless, of course, this happens, you know? So you just put a little hug around, of course, because you don't need that, right? But you might see that happen too. Does that rule kind of make sense? I know it's a little bit of a tricky one, but it's adding words to the end of a sentence, kind of. And a lot of the times they'll do it where, like, here, if you put a period, does this make sense? Is that okay? No, because unless, of course, Addie got hurt isn't a sentence, right? So that's the type of thing they'll make you differentiate. So just vaguely remember this rule that you can do it, but it's a little bit ambiguous on when to use it and stuff. But yeah, just know this one's out there. I wouldn't stress too much about it. But most of the time, that first rule is going to be the one that you're going to be using. Are we okay with this? Okay? Online? Kinda? Yeah? Okay. Great. Let's go on to hyphens then. Will be our last punctuation mark. Hyphens. Now, there's a lot of little rules, actually. You'd be surprised. There's quite a bit. There's 5, but they're all very, very, very easy. They're all very specific, and it's this rule or it's not this rule. There's one that's tricky that I'm going to save for last. But 4 of them I say are pretty straightforward. We'll talk about those. Let's start with hyphens. They look like this. They're like little. Now, the differentiation a lot of people like to use between hyphens and dashes is hyphens are in between words, dashes are in between clauses. So dashes are big. You could separate them with clauses. Hyphens fit in between little words to make them combine together. So you say them as one word almost. Let's start with the first and most obvious rule with hyphens is that they connect words with numbers. Now there's a lot of different ways you could do this. Let's say I walk into the city and I see this huge building and I'm describing how tall it is. And I want to say it's a 320-foot tall building. Does that make sense? Where I put a hyphen right here. So 320 foot tall. I connected a number to a word. Does that make sense? Now let's say we're talking about this random kid I met. He's 12 years old. I would have to say 12-year-old. Does that make sense? 12-year-old. Hyphens. That's all technically one word. Now it doesn't matter if you write the number as a number or like spell it out. You still have to use hyphens. 12-year-old, doesn't matter if it's written like this or like this. Does that make sense? Yeah? So, anytime you're connecting a number to a word, the most common uses are this. When you're describing like a really tall thing or like a wide, like a 20-foot wide hole in the ground or something. Or like a year-old is a really common one. You're going to put hyphens in between. Does that make sense? Yeah? Good? Online? Awesome. Okay, I like to think this one's pretty straightforward. It's not too bad. Second one, or I would say even easier actually, because you don't really have to think about it. It just is. Anytime you use great relatives or in-laws, you're going to use a hyphen. So remember we were talking earlier about a brother-in-law and I told you it was hyphenated, but I didn't tell you why. Well, it just follows this rule, simply. So the one sorry, I'll let you guys write it down. So any type of great relative, right, above your grandparents or below your grandkids, which hopefully none of us have that problem, but greats and in-laws are going to be. So like a brother-in-law is brother-in-law. Or maybe you want great grandpa. Just put a hyphen in between. Does that make sense? A pretty simple one. You just have to, yeah. Not too much to it. I don't know what else to say about this one. Does that make sense? Online, we get that. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Let's jump on to the third rule now. Again, this one, pretty straightforward. There's a lot of examples of this rule, and it applies to like a billion different things and a lot of different compound words. Any sort of, they're called compound words when they have the hyphen in them. So compound words with the prefix self. A lot of words follow this. Can someone give me an example? Does anyone know an example of like a self something? Go ahead.
Self-sufficient.
Self-sufficient is a great example. How about, anyone else got one? Yeah?
Self-centered.
Self-centered, great. Any more?
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem, that's a tricky one, yeah. Self-esteem also uses a hyphen. You guys got any?
Self-care.
Self-care, yeah, good. Got one?
Selfish.
Not quite selfish. That one doesn't exactly use the prefix. Selfish is just one word, like that. But like, think of, all of these are using another word, right? Like self-centered, self-esteem, what did you say? Self-care, that's another word. So think of like, when you have another word attached to the end of it. So like, if someone doesn't have a boss and they're their own employer, what are they called?
Self-employed.
Self-employed, yeah. So that's another one where employed is a word by itself. That's how you can tell that it's going to be a hyphen instead of ish itself isn't a word, right? So that's how you know. Self-directed is another one. I don't know, I'm running out of examples. You guys gave great examples though, but that's the idea. Anytime you have a compound word like that, how do you spell esteem? That's a tricky one. Is it S-T-E, like that? S-T-E-E-M? I don't know. We'll call it good. But self-esteem, yeah, another one that esteem is a word by itself, and then just, yeah. Cool, that makes sense? There's a lot of compound words with self, but if you have two words, basically, anytime you have self something and the whole thing makes sense as a word by itself, you're going to use a hyphen in between. Cool? Online, does that make sense? Yeah. Great. I'm seeing thumbs up. Awesome. Okay. Oh, why did I never changed that. Sorry. Last one. Well, last easy one. We'll do one more. It's a little more tricky. The last super easy one is going to be when you spell out fractions. Anytime you spell out fractions, when you write it like in your math classes, you write them like this, right? With the bar like that, like 2/3, like that. Sometimes when you write them, when you're like writing something, you could write like this. All right, we use a little slash. And the ACT, this is grammatically not technically the correct rule when you're like writing an article or something. What they want you to do is this here. So you spell it out and you hyphenate. So 2/3. Does that make sense? So all of these mean the same thing, right? It's just when you're writing, you want to choose that one. Does that kind of make sense? It's kind of a lame rule, but yeah, anytime you spell out fractions, you're going to use a hyphen. Online, does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, sweet. Awesome. This last one can be a little bit tricky, but it's not too bad. You're going to have... Oops. Okay, so the rule technically is you're going to use combination words with prepositional phrases. So, does anyone know what a preposition is? I'm not going to give you an ugly definition for preposition. It's more just like in, on, of, those type of words. These little prepositions that describe something like that. So a prepositional phrase, for example, would be, I hope you guys have heard of this one. I'm going to feel old if you haven't. Like a jack of all trades. Of is your preposition, right? And this is a whole prepositional phrase, jack of all trades. You know, so if someone's a jack of all trades, then you would use hyphens between them. How about, maybe another one would be like, if you're trying to say someone's unique, you could say like a 1 in a million. 1 in a million person. Does that make sense? So again, we have a preposition in. We have another one with in. Oh, I got one. How about like down in the dumps? Right? That's another phrase. With the in. I'm gonna try to think of one more example with on, because I want you guys to see on as well. Oh, I don't know if you guys will know this one, but this might be a little too British. You guys know Johnny on the Spot? Has anyone heard Johnny on the Spot before? Yeah? Okay, thank God. Okay, there you go. You'll hear it there. But Johnny on the Spot's another example of a prepositional phrase where we have our preposition on. Does anyone have any other examples? I can't really think of any more. I don't know. 1 in a million is a good one. I don't know. But does this make sense how like little phrases like this, little prepositional phrases? A lot of the times they have like metaphorical meanings, right? Like we don't literally mean a jack of all trades. That doesn't mean anything to you. But like when you say jack of all trades, it means something else. Same with like 1 in a million. We don't literally mean 1 in a million. Or like down in the dumps, we don't mean someone's physically in the dumps. We just like are talking metaphorically, right? So a lot of these phrases have metaphorical meanings, but does that make sense? Awesome. Online, are we good with that? Sweet. All right. And you made it. Those are all of the possible ACT punctuation rules that you could see on the ACT English test. So, my recommendation for you guys from here would be, like I said at the beginning, punctuation is really important on the ACT because they're technically the fastest going questions. So, it's important that you know these rules and practice them at least a little bit. So what I did when I first had this situation, I made kind of like what I had you guys do. This is why I do it. I had like a note sheet, and I just had one cheat sheet for every single punctuation rule, and I organized it very similar to what I've done for you guys here. And for about 2 weeks, right before I went to bed, it took 5 minutes, I'd read through every single rule. And then it was only 2 weeks, 14 days. And after that, I could remember the rules like for the rest of my life. Like I remember them now still, and I'm still able to use these to this day because of 2 weeks of reading them before I went to bed. So my only recommendation is just look at them at least a little bit, or try to think about them a little bit every single day, just for a little bit, and then they're gonna stick in your brain and you're gonna remember them, and you're not gonna have to study them again. But I do organize it this way and make sure you guys take notes in an organized fashion so that you can look at them again, because just hearing me talk about them once isn't going to do anything. I do need a little bit of work on your guys' part, right, to actively look at them and try to remember them, right? So that's my recommendation with this. Just, we've gone through everything you can see. So you should feel okay about these. And then one more piece of advice or a tip I can give is when you're going through the actual test and you're not sure if a comma goes here or there, like, oh, I can't tell, then try to justify to yourself, what rule does this follow? Like, why would I put a punctuation mark here? What rule is this? And if you can't think of a rule that justifies it being there, it probably should be there. Like, that's the importance of knowing these rules, is that if it doesn't follow one of these rules, then you can also eliminate that because you know it's not correct. A lot of the times we think, oh, we know it's correct because it follows this rule. But you can also do it the other way, where it doesn't follow any of my rules, so it's not correct. So it might help you narrow things down when you're not super sure, you know? It can be helpful that way too, but yeah. Okay, we have like a few minutes. Does anyone have any punctuation questions? Online, you guys have any questions about punctuation? No? Okay, does anyone have an English-related question about the ACT English test at all? Nothing? Online, you guys have anything? Okay, does anyone have an ACT question? It doesn't have to be about English. Nothing? Okay.
Okay,
Yeah,
well,
go
I
ahead.
heard this one thing, when I was with one of my friends, and he said that, like, a lot of the times, like, when you're, like, stuck between two answers, and, like, it would be, like, a phrase, if that makes sense, that sometimes the best, like, option would be the shorter one.
Yeah, we will absolutely be covering that rule next week. It's one of the golden grammar rules. The question was about, she said one of her friends was talking about the ACT, and if you have two things that are pretty similar, one of them might be like a longer phrase and the other might be a shorter one. If you're picking between those two, you're going to more often than not pick the shorter one. That is absolutely true, and that's one of the most important rules in the ACT, like, business. It's called, I'll give you a quick pre-talk about it. We'll cover it extensively next week, or next time I'm here, I guess. But we call that the economy rule. So you want to be the most economical you can. If you can say something in less words, why would you use more words, right? Like, especially on, like, articles and stuff, we want to pack in the most meaning we can. So, like, you don't want to say something as comical and humorous, you know, because, like, that means the same thing. Why would you want to say it's comical and humorous? It's just comical, or it's just funny, how about? So you want to pick shorter answers more often than not. If you're really stuck between two, the shorter one's going to be right, yeah. So that, we'll talk about it properly next week and how to avoid redundancy and stuff too, but yeah, more often than not, if you're really stuck, you can just pick the shortest one and it's going to make sense. The ACT does this thing where they'll have like an answer choice that, 4 answer choices, one of them is one word and the other ones have stuff after the word, and people get convinced that, oh, this one sounds better, or like this one makes more, or it's more detailed. But it's important to remember, more detailed doesn't always mean like more precise or more correct, because a lot of the time it goes on to repeat things. So yeah, that your friend is absolutely right. We'll cover that rule next week. Anyone else have any other questions? No? Online, last chance? Okay, awesome. Well, I'll let you guys go a few minutes early then. Take a break here.